Hello, and welcome to Morgan Meets the Eye. My name is Evan Morgan, and I'm the host of this series. So first things first, I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I do want to encourage you to follow me on social media. My Twitter handle is @NotSpicedRum, and my Instagram handle is @SomeGuyNamedMorgan. So make sure to subscribe to my YouTube page, and certainly keep up with the show on Apple, Spotify, or upon whichever streaming platforms it is available. So right off the bat today, I will be speaking with MRH Legacy, a content creator within the Austrian School of Economics, and he has made many highly informative videos that are deeply critical of government intervention in both social and economic affairs, and is certainly one of the more prominent anarcho-capitalist creators on YouTube. So if you're one of those fools out there who just adamantly insists that the state is a necessary institution within our society, then I implore you to give him a listen. So with that said, MRH Legacy, thanks for coming on the show, and where can people go to check out your work?
Yeah, thanks for having me. You can just go, my YouTube channel is just my name, MRH Legacy. Really, every platform that I'm on, it's the same username. So Twitter is just @MRH Legacy. I also have there's a new Twitter platform called Noster too that I'm on, but mostly everything that I do is either on Twitter or YouTube. So
Nice. So I guess, just starting out, I'll just jump right into it. So what is it you believe exactly?
I believe that, the state is, number one, it's an evil and unjust institution, and it has to be abolished in some manner. It's really just it's the principal aggressor in society. It's not the only evil, but it is the most invasive one, at least right now. And that in its place should be numerous private institutions. I believe in private property first and foremost, and anything that infringes on it is wrong and bad. That's pretty much the gist.
I'm definitely somebody who would, consider himself, an anarcho-capitalist. But the thing is that I'm not nearly as informed on this subject as you are. So sometimes I have kind of some type of wavering doubt. And I've noticed that a lot of people, there's a lot of debate between people over what role the government should have in our society. And some people say it should have, this much of a role or this much of a role. We have the anarchists. We also have the minarchists. We have some people who believe in larger government and things like that. So in that case, so when somebody, like an anarcho-capitalist such as ourselves come along and they say that there should be no government whatsoever, a lot of people might hear that and they might dismiss the anarcho-capitalist perspective as just overly simplistic or lacking a nuanced understanding of the situation. So I guess what would you say to them, and what exact line of reasoning, led you to the conclusion that there should be no state at all within our society?
Well, ultimately, I hear this a lot that, anarchists, they're naive. People say the same. If you ever notice, you talk to people like this, they always say something like, when I was 14, I used to be an anarchist too, or whatever. Which is really funny to me because they all say the same thing, which is already a bad starting point. But ultimately, I figured out that anarchy is actually the reasonable solution, and minarchy, this idea that we're going to have one giant monopoly that is going to supply, the most important things in society, that's the most ridiculous thing ever. I mean, we don't believe that in just basic neoclassical economic theory. They teach that monopolies are going to provide goods at a worse quality and at a higher price than everything else, and therefore we have to limit monopolies, except when it comes to the most important things in society, police and border controls and roads and education. All that stuff can be monopolized by one institution. That's good. But I mean, if we monopolize TV production, then we know that monopoly, Apple or whatever, they're going to charge way too much for their iPhone, so we have to limit it in such and such fashion. I mean, just on the base of it, that's ridiculous. And it's ridiculous that this is, accepted by the population. But there's also, I'm sure we'll get into it, but there's more nuanced arguments that sometimes minarchists will put forward than just, the base, just feelings like, oh, anarchy is ridiculous. It's really, really not. You accept the free market in every other facet of your life. Why wouldn't you accept it for the most important goods of society?
Basically, my general understanding of it is that, economics can be a very, complicated field, and there's definitely no denying that. But there's also no denying that including a state in the mix, the presence of a state in the society is going to make it even more complicated, because you essentially have to plan around that and work around that, and just, I think it makes things, complicate things than they would, more so than they would be otherwise.
Oh, so, definitely.
Yeah. So, I mean, I definitely, like I didn't just come out of the womb an anarcho-capitalist, obviously. It was something where, I kind of worked my way into that. I kind of started out getting into the Austrian school after a while and kind of worked my way down until I realized that, the optimal way to run a society would be with no state at all. I mean, that would be, like the way I see it, I often say, small government is a small problem, but it's a small problem nonetheless. It's still a problem at the end of the day.
Right.
And I often said, sometimes I wake up a Rothbardian, but some days I would wake up a Hayekian. But now I would, consider myself, strictly up with, down, with Rothbard or Hoppe to an extent as well. So, anyway, with that said, what do you think is the biggest cognitive error that's really preventing the vast majority of people from recognizing anarcho-capitalism as a legitimate ideology?
Well, that's the most difficult question. I think Hoppe also has a quote on this. It's like, the most interesting question is really, because what that kind of question gets at is, why does the state even exist in the first place? If this is so, obviously bad, how is it that there's this monopoly on everything, and how did it come about?
I mean, I often think of, the conquest theory of state formation. I feel like I talk about Franz Oppenheimer way too much on this show, but, it is something where I bring up his research as far as, the primitive societies that essentially, bandits would take over these lands. They would essentially create their own state by force and, forcing it on the people, So I know Rothbard speaks about that in Anatomy of the State as well. So that's definitely something that I often think of when I think about how the state really came into being in the first place. Not so much because people needed it out of necessity, but more just because it was forced on them by essentially tyrants, bandits, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, kind of. The thing is, it's a little bit more slow of a push. Like, for example, the adoption of fiat money or whatever. The idea that we have paper money that we use in daily exchanges, that can't just occur naturally. There's no way for that to happen, and there's no way for the government to even say, okay, now everybody's going to accept dollars. How that occurs is that there's a period over, even a couple hundred years or 1,000 years, that there's periods of infringements that get worse and worse and worse as time goes on, that people are willing to accept, and eventually you get to a point where, the money's totally worthless. And I think that can be applied to just the formation of the state in general, that the state doesn't just come out of nowhere, but rather people accept, a gang providing them such and such, protection for such and such period of time, and then that state proceeds to take over every other smaller thing over that period and legitimizes itself in the minds of the majority.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, for example, we can see this. I mean, even if we look at America, for example, I know a lot of people do like the founding fathers. I mean, I definitely think that they're romanticized to an extent. The values that this country was started with, and then we look at I mean, as good as the plan might have been, when this country was first started, it hasn't even been 250 years later now. And I mean, look how things are now. I mean, we've completely just, I think, regressed. We've gone against a lot of different values here. So, I mean, like, as good as the goal might have been in the beginning, there were definitely flaws in it, because the way I see, how this could, our current society could result from that, and there had to have been some holes in it that allowed it to get to where it is now. So.
Right. It could even be argued that was their intention. That the beginning, the coup that is the Constitution that took over the Articles of Confederation is not only either. I mean, this is what's his name, Lysander Spooner's argument that the Constitution either allowed for the society to occur or didn't stop it from happening. So either way, it's totally useless, and we should just ignore it.
And I've noticed that when a lot of statists will argue, I try to think from their perspective, I think, do these people see themselves as apologists for authoritarianism? And the truth is that consciously they probably don't. I think from their perspective, they probably think that they're being pragmatic or just realistic, calling for the state. And I do see that as a pretty superficial viewpoint here, because a lot of people will say that, a forceful monopoly is necessary in some cases, these people will say, to prevent tyranny. And I find that kind of interesting, because tyranny and a forceful monopoly are borderline, synonymous, really. So I just think I just think that these people are a bit misguided in this. And I think that there's definitely some type of miscommunication as well. When we call for capitalism, I think a lot of people tend to imagine more of a corporate cronyist society. And I remember I was in one of my grad school classes, and we had some type of forum there. So I just people would be talking about random economic things that were going on. So one day I just posted about, the Austrian school, about Mises and things like that. I was talking about how, I'm a big follower of that. And some guy in their comments was, arguing with me about how, how he didn't approve of this pro-capitalist, small government type of thing, because he was talking about examples of how, look at all these corporate bailouts and look at all that's going on because of that. And I thought, corporate bailouts are the result of government intervention in the economy. So I don't know what point he was trying to make exactly. But, I just think that it goes to show that a lot of people tend to associate, when you're calling for a freer market, they tend to associate that with some type of Ben Shapiro-esque, neoliberal, neocon, cronyism, really, where the market isn't really free, but it tends to exist mainly to serve the interests of, a smaller minority. That's just basically my take on it, really.
I mean, yeah, and I mean, I agree. Most people do not think that when they're saying that I support the state or whatever, that there should exist a state. They're not saying that, I'm in favor of tyranny. I believe that everybody should be aggressed against. No. They believe basically that what you said, that they're being pragmatic. And the problem is with most of these people's mindsets is, I think they're kind of empiricists at heart. They believe that you have to, in order to validate a theory, you have to posit a hypothesis and then test it. And because anarcho-capitalism and what, Rothbardians or Hoppians or whatever will describe as an anarcho-capitalist society, they don't have anything that exists in the modern day that we can point to and say, like, this is exactly what we want. So they go, well, then it must not exist, right? So they don't have an experience to tell them that what we're describing is possible. And that's part of the issue. And then further, like what you were talking about with corporate bailouts and things like that. Yeah, exactly. That's all basically all the government's fault in the first place. If the government didn't exist, those things wouldn't exist. So those are opposite to the free market.
I mean, that actually kind of leads me to another point too. I've gotten into arguments with people, in the workplace about it. Sometimes I think I'm wasting my time even talking about it with my coworkers, but, they'll be telling me about how, and I've made the error, in my early days when arguing for it of saying that, I am speaking from a theoretical position here. So then they'll say, well, I'm speaking from, a realistic, from actual fact. And they'll be talking about how, with it. And this actually leads me to my next point, deregulation. They'll be talking about how when the government is deregulating, these societies, that leads to such and such problems, X and Y and all of that. And, we can prove that empirically, and I think that is, a very misleading way of saying that, because first of all, we've had societies throughout the world that are very close approximations to, what Rothbard would call to. I mean, I saw your video about the Old West and, how some people might argue that is, that's the U.S. and, there's government there. I mean, the government in that portion of the country at that time was non-existent, really. So we can simply, that's just negligible there. But, I think that, we can point to these societies and how they were run, and I think we can look at that as definitely a good ideal to work to in these cases. So I don't think it's fair to simply say that, because this guy's speaking from theory, that therefore his idea is inferior. When, first of all, I don't even think that, if an idea works in theory, I mean, I think that's a good thing. We shouldn't simply shoot that down just because it hasn't been practiced. I mean, there could be reasons other than it's inherently flawed that an idea hasn't been practiced, for example. I think especially in the case of anarcho-capitalism.
Right. And I mean, pointing to those sort of societies like I did in that video on the Wild West definitely has use. But the problem that I was outlining was more that people don't have that personal experience. They've never lived in a society like that. They don't actually know of one that really exists. And any society like Cospaya, for example, that's just brushed off as like totally ridiculous. Like nobody even knows what that is. And then the Wild West, people actually think that's a bad thing because they've been taught, in such and such, public education or whatever, that the Wild West, it was full of these, horrible, violent people, and that the government came in and they shut everything down and made everything great when they, colonized the whole area. But further, a lot of these people's ideas about theory being wrong, it's because, like I said before, they have a barrier in their mind, and you hear this. Have you ever talked to post-libertarians before, by any chance?
Yeah,
they have the same exact refutation that people who aren't even familiar with anarcho-capitalism has. I'm living in reality, and you're just living in your head, or you're just living in theory. This is because they're not able to distinguish between descriptions of reality that are theoretical in nature, which is what, Hoppe has this, and this is a little bit technical, but Hoppe has this book, Economic Science and the Austrian Method, in which he talks about what the origins of the a priori synthetic knowledge are, and like what's the difference between that and a posteriori synthetic knowledge, which basically means that, like, take the statement, aspirin cures a headache or whatever, right? I can't know that that's true. So what I have to do is I posit that as a hypothesis, and then I go out and I test that, and then I see if my results confirm or rather support or falsify that hypothesis. But with a priori synthetic knowledge, that's knowledge derived from irrefutable axioms. Like, for example, the statement that sentences cannot contradict, or the law of identity that Ayn Rand uses a lot, that A is A. These are things that can be used to build upon a grander theory, or as Mises uses it, man acts. He uses the axiom that man acts, which cannot be denied, because in order to deny it, you'd have to affirm it. So if I say that I cannot act, I must be acting in order to say that I cannot act, right? And then we can build economic laws that have actual synthetic empirical applications to the real world. The theory describes reality. We don't just take a whole bunch of random data in the world and then try to extrapolate reasons for that. If we're trying to prove causation, we have to actually sit down and derive those causes. So we can derive the fact that the minimum wage, for example, will cause unemployment. We don't have to go out and test that the minimum wage is going to cause unemployment, in the same sense that if I wanted to say that, if I wanted to say a square circle exists, I don't have to test that in Africa 50 million times to see that a square circle doesn't exist. It just doesn't make any sense.
I mean, people seem to be really definitely confusing, the whole theory versus reality. I mean, if something works in reality, it's because it works in theory. So, I mean, I don't really understand, why they would be shooting it down so quickly like that. So, basically, from here, so I kind of see myself basically as the ANCAP equivalent of, let's say, Dave Rubin, for example. And I mean that both in a positive way, but also as a negative way, because I like to see myself as a generally affable person, but I'm not admittedly the most skilled debater, and I feel like the same could be said for Dave Rubin in that example. But I am somebody who wants to give a spotlight to certain ideas. And, after all, this is, as Dave Rubin would say, the marketplace of ideas. So I wanted to bring you on so that because I know that you're a lot more informed on this topic than I am, so that I could run some of the more, persistent, arguments that have been used against anarcho-capitalism, and just, I want to steelman these and just have you provide, some responses to them, to kind of just put these ideas down in this case, just so that people can finally understand that there is actually a counterpoint to these arguments, that they're not just the nail in the coffin that they think they are. So starting off, really the first topic I wanted to, discuss was, basically the concept of, the problem of deregulation. For example, some people might say that, back in the day, when there were traffic fatalities were going on, people didn't have seatbelts or things like that. People talk about, car regulations being put out by the government, and they might say that this has reduced deaths from auto fatalities. And, or examples such as, FDA regulations or things like that, because of these organizations, people might look at these and, extract from that, these have done something good for society. They've brought about a social benefit. They've saved lives. So because of that, they would say that is, they'll act as though that is, proof that, the government is necessary. So what would be your rebuttal to that?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, and this is probably just going to affect any time that any empirical example is brought up, is that, like, in order to analyze why that specific thing occurred in the way it did, I would have to, be a historian or whatever. I'd have to go back into, seatbelt laws and see, like, where exactly things changed. Just attributing it to the government is not something that I can just be like, yes, well, you must be right, therefore the government, exists. This is part of the problem with what we were talking about before, with just the empiricist methodology, is like, well, this thing happened in history, and I think it caused, and afterwards, things got better. So things were bad, the government stepped in, now things are good, therefore the government is good. That's a common fallacy. I think it's called ad hoc, ergo propter hoc, or, something similar, where basically what they're doing is they're doing exactly that. They're taking, or for example, say I go outside and it's raining, and then I drink water, and then the rain stops, and I say, well, therefore, I should go out and drink more water. outside, because then rain will stop whenever it's raining, right? That doesn't follow. That doesn't prove causation in any way. It is literally, and I know people don't like this as a fallacy, but people commit it constantly. It is correlation without causation. You're not actually proving that one necessarily caused the other. But then that's not always the best response to people, because they don't look at that as satisfactory. But what is satisfactory is the market can take care of those same goods that apparently the government, had to take care of at such and such time. If people demanded that things be regulated in, such and such fashion, say that, I don't want my food being poisoned. I mean, that's pretty, intuitive. Why wouldn't there be a whole bunch of regulatory agencies that are totally private that may put their stamp on, such and such company's food? And then I would only buy companies that use that stamp. I'm not going to buy from some random company if I suspect that poison might be in it. It doesn't make any sense. So that's generally just the response that I put forward on that one.
Right, exactly. A lot of people, they seem to say, well, what about X? What about Y? And a lot of the time, the truth is that anarcho-capitalism isn't against, X or Y in themselves. They're against them as, as a government monopoly, as being provided solely by the state. So, I was actually watching, I think it was Patrick Bet-David. He had Noam Chomsky on as the guest, and he was talking about anarchism and all of that. So then, I think Patrick Bet-David was talking about, okay, so let's try to scale back, the government's role and, all these, and try to deregulate it. And then suddenly Chomsky, supposedly the massive anarchist he's supposed to be, was suddenly talking about, no, you can't deregulate. No, that's a terrible idea. It's like, that'll just destroy everything. And I was thinking, it seems like a bit of a contradiction to me personally, but we tend to see that, I think. I've noticed a lot with the left anarchists.
There's another point too.
Twitter recently. Sure.
Sorry. I have one more little thing on the last thing. There's also people don't think about the costs of whatever regulations that they're putting on. So like if the FDA has to step in and regulate such and such industry, well, how much should it be regulated? How much are we going to pay regulators to go in and regulate everything? What are the rules exactly? And the thing is, since these businesses have no other, options to choose from, they don't have 3 different FDAs that they can choose, which regulations they want to abide by, and then the consumers don't get to choose. Whatever the FDA says goes, and however much money they're going to pay for certain things, that goes. So what happens if we're making massive losses? There would be no way to tell. And now you have this massive resource drain across the entire economy for regulations that may be totally worthless, and you would never know. But sorry, go ahead with what you were.
But yeah, I was actually thinking, I saw somebody on Twitter, that's actually a great point you brought up, though. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was wanting sure people can hear that. But I was on Twitter, and, I don't even know if you might have seen this too, where there was somebody who was on the anarchist subreddit or something, and he was calling for the abolition of the IRS, and they actually booted him off of the subreddit just for saying that. And I thought, these same people are going to be the same ones who turn around and say that the anarcho-capitalists aren't the real anarchists when they're out, defending the IRS, probably one of the worst institutions within the state. I don't know,
many such cases.
Ridiculous. Yeah. So yeah, the next case I wanted to use, this is one I hear a lot, from, people within, against the movement, is that anarcho-capitalism is just synonymous with feudalism. They've declared very matter-of-factly. Sometimes they will concede that, well, yes, in feudalism there was a king, so technically there was a state. So then they call it neo-feudalism. But, I'm just curious how you would respond to people who, refer to anarcho-capitalism in this way.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. This may not be the most satisfactory answer, but the thing is with feudalism is, I am not a historian, and I don't know enough about feudalism to say that it was, mostly voluntary or mostly involuntary. So it very well could be that anarcho-capitalism is very, very similar to feudalism. And this is a point Hoppe actually makes in his new book. It's really just a collection of essays. Economy, Society, and History. He has an essay in there where he basically says, feudalism was given a bad name. It's pretty damn close. Oh, sorry, can I swear? I don't know.
Oh, of course, yes.
Is that okay? Okay. Yeah, it's pretty damn similar to. Okay, it's pretty similar to anarcho-capitalism, and he basically says that there were lords, and these lords were only listened to voluntarily, and the serfs could leave and go to other lords if they felt that their lord was being bad or not, taking too much of their money, and some people would voluntarily go to kings, or who he would say are just natural leaders in charge at the time, who didn't have any aggressive authority on things. And there was a rigid separation of church and state, so the church was independent, and people looked to the church as a sort of a different authority than the state to challenge it whenever it was wrong on such and such, or the king, rather. I don't think Kappa would say it's a state. If it was wrong on such and such theory. So if you take that perspective on feudalism, then yeah, anarcho-capitalism is pretty similar to feudalism, if not, the same. But in a theory of socialism and capitalism, he actually says the exact opposite, where in the essay on social, I think it's on the conservative socialism, he describes feudalism as basically a rigid hierarchy arbitrarily enforced by a king, in which the king's at the top, and then you have the lords under him, and then the soldiers under them, and then the serfs under them, and you were not able to move from, one echelon to the other because of some arbitrary, government force. And if that's the case, then anarcho-capitalism is not like that at all, and it really is just a conservative socialism as he describes. So, I mean, again, not super satisfactory. But it's not clear to me one way or another if anarcho-capitalism is like feudalism or not. If it involves arbitrary aggressive force, it's not, nowhere near it. If it doesn't, if feudalism is not like that, well, then anarcho-capitalism is pretty similar.
Right. When people say that anarcho-capitalism is, very similar to feudalism, I tend to say, yes, it sure is. Or like, go on. I feel like there's just a little more to talk about in that conversation than they're presenting it as. I remember, I think even it was towards the end of the Roman Empire. I'm not too familiar with the history behind it, but I know there was some emperor who was passed some decree that, the occupation of a father would have to be the occupation of his son. And, this kind of policy, was terrible because it prevented, anybody from really moving up, kind of kept people stuck within their own roles. And you kind of kept, the people within power, despite, their actual performance. But, I think that I remember that being something that really contributed towards the fall of the Roman Empire as well. But like I said, I'm not.
This is exactly what Hupp describes. In a theory of socialism and capitalism, Hupp describes this exact thing where, you would have a position that you were not allowed to leave in because, birthright or whatever, or because your family was in that position and you weren't given authority by, the king to move up. And that's why he says that, liberalism was a step in the right direction, that basically allowing people to move about wherever they were most efficient is, best. But then, again, later he says, no, that's not the case. Feudalism is actually not like that. So,
I mean, yes, exactly. That points exactly to the issues with the state here. I mean, when they pass decrees such as this, it's passed by people who are at the top, obviously. They're trying to consolidate their own power at the top. It's not for the good of society, but they're using state power to essentially give themselves security. But in the long run, this is obviously self-defeating anyway, since it's going to hurt production. It's going to, damage society as a whole anyway. So it's going to damage their own quality of living in the grand scheme of things by pushing such policies. And, another example I want to talk about was, this one's pretty persistent, Coconut Island. I've seen a lot of people pushing this. I think most notably the YouTuber Vosh was talking about this whole theory where basically, let's say two people crash onto a deserted island. Somebody is woken up before you. You wake up to find that they've claimed all of the coconuts on the island for themselves. And now, they're saying that, sure, you can have some, but they want you to perform a certain task for them in order to do that. And it might be, something that's very, something that's horrifying and something that's, very much against your own will. So they might pose that as an involuntary transaction here. So basically, what would be your response to people who say that? Who bring this argument?
Coconut Island is... so Coconut Island, I cover this in a little bit in debunking every anti-capitalist argument ever. I think it's the last argument that I use in the section on the left. But the problem, there are so many problems with this. And first and foremost is that it's not even an argument. It doesn't actually challenge the basis of private property. All it is like, well, what about this situation? Doesn't this make you feel bad? It's like, okay, maybe, but is that an argument against private property? Why does that say that it's wrong? If I'm looking for an ethic, or rather, to be more specific, a legal code, I'm looking for a rational legal code. I'm not looking for an intuitive legal code. I'm not looking for something that makes me feel good. I'm looking for something that can be proven, right? So if I'm proving the existence of property rights and then someone comes to me and says, does this make you feel bad? Okay, maybe, who cares? but a lot of the time that's also not a super satisfactory answer for people. But so if we just, work within its own bounds for a second, if we just change it slightly and we make the person who are horribly evil coconut hoarder, he lands on the island and maybe he's, really, really bad at, or maybe he gathers he's great at finding food. So what he does is he finds more food than the second person who, fell unconscious was able to. And he gathers it all up. And then the guy who's unconscious wakes up and he comes to the guy with our horribly evil coconut hoarder, and our horribly evil coconut hoarder says to him, well, if you build us both a shelter, then I'll give you some food. Isn't that fair? Well, would the communists say, oh, no, he's exploiting this guy? Is our coconut hoarder, being evil in some fashion for doing this? I mean, Lenin wouldn't even believe this. He had this whole dictum, if you don't work, you don't eat. This is something that has to exist for all societies, or else you start rewarding the unproductive at the expense of the productive. And then what happens? Well, you get more unproductive people, and then people get really, really poor, and you get into these horrible Malthusian conditions where if you have too many kids, then people just start to die off, right? Society can't support anybody because there aren't enough resources that were built up by previous capital investment, because you've gone and penalized capital investment. But even further from that, let's just say our coconut hoarder is, horribly selfish. And I think the original analogy is, if I gather all the coconuts on my island and then this guy comes to me and he says, I want a coconut, and I say, suck my dick or whatever, then I'll give you coconuts. Isn't this rape? Well, it's like, would it be preferable to you if they just withheld the coconuts altogether? Like, if I just didn't offer the coconuts, is that guy in a better position now than he was before? I don't think so. I mean, the guy clearly wants food. Yeah.
It's pretty much the same outcome either way.
Yeah, exactly. But then further from that is like, Marxists they like to differentiate between private and personal property a lot. And they say private property is just, capital or goods that are used only for exchange. And that personal property is truly property. Like, for example, in a communist utopia, they say, or so it goes, I will, I don't have to share my toothbrush or whatever with you because that's personal property. But I do have to share the means of production because that's, capital. That's private property, and private property is the bad thing. Well, in the case of the coconut island, if I just keep all the coconuts and I don't exchange any of them, are you going to tell me that this guy has to surrender the coconuts anyway? Because if so, then you don't care about personal property either. You don't care about property at all. So why even pretend that you care about one or the other? And this is something that, Kropotkin, who he wrote The Conquest of Bread, an actual anarcho-capitalist or actual anarcho-communist, he says, no, there is no differentiation between private and personal property. I get all of it. Like, you have to share everything because there's no distinction. And it's like, I prefer to deal with those people because at least they're honest, right? But then even further from that, the coconut analogy, continues on. And let's say that let's go back to the original circumstance where, you have the guy and he hoards all the coconuts, and then this guy comes up to him and says, I want a coconut. And then the guy says, no, suck my dick. Well, what about in the case that, I have to have sex to survive? Well, then is our coconut hoarder or our actual rape victim does he have to have sex with the person who needs to have sex? Doesn't that seem like a bit of a contradiction that both of these things are simultaneously rape? I have to have sex in order to live. Am I entitled to it from you then? Then that is actually rape. That's an actual invasion of private property boundaries. And there's plenty of other, issues that come along with the Coconut Island. And the main one focuses around the fact that it's just not an argument at all. So there's no way to even really attack it without just making these intuitive appeals to people. That's pretty much the gist of it.
Right, exactly. Right. I mean, in the sex example, they're basically using, technically your body could be considered private property to an extent, so I guess you owe that to somebody else. I mean, it seems like a, pretty silly example for them to use. And, I've often thought, too, one problem with this example, the Coconut Island problem, is that it's two people. I mean, if you take a look at this, it's trying to take things in such a vacuum overall. So that if there are two people there and somebody's claiming all the resources from this one other person, if he's just this one person, he doesn't really have, let's say, if we're being just very brutal and, realistic about human nature here, he doesn't really have any means of securing his property if he's just one person and there's this other person who wants it. So, if he's denying this person these things by any circumstances, what's going to prevent this other person from just killing him, frankly, and just taking it for himself? If he dies, he's got no problem. So, I mean, I know that's kind of a bleak answer, but I mean, it just seems to me that that's something that a lot of people don't take into consideration in this sort of instance. But that's just one way I look at it.
Well, the only thing is when
obviously that's not something I want to clarify too. I'm by no means advocating killing anybody. I'm saying that realistically could very well occur to somebody who has less of a moral fiber.
Right, but I'm when people say the coconut argument thing, I mean there's the other explanation that, well, what if 50 people crash? Well, then they're all going to work to whatever they're best at, just by comparative advantage, and this is far more representative of an actual working capitalist economy than two people landing on an island. But I think it's fine for them to bring up this hypothetical just to test the principle itself, to be like, okay, I'm going to put you in a situation in which you're purposefully, a hypothetical in which your principles lead me to a conclusion that I don't really like. Fine, then I'm totally fine that, responding to that. And that's something that I have to respond to. But ultimately, it's not an argument. All it is this makes me feel bad. They're not showing a contradiction anywhere.
So yes, there's another example I see that a lot of people try to use as a sort of variation, a kind of tweaking of the Coconut Island, example, where it seems as though they're trying to anticipate some of the arguments against it, and they're trying to reinforce it that way. So yes, I saw this comic on Existential Comics. You're trying to break this down. So basically, the story going on here is that I guess Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Marx are on some ship in the middle of the ocean. But because Karl Marx is just so bombed on brandy, the ship ends up crashing, and they end up washing up on, Liberty Island in this case. So they end up running into, Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard there. So they're telling them about how, all the interactions are free and everything's voluntary. So they tell them then that the only resources are coconuts and fish. So in this case, Karl Marx says that he'll try to go get some coconuts, but Ayn Rand says, well, those coconut trees actually belong to her because they'd already gotten there, they had already claimed that as their property. And so, from here, Murray Rothbard is saying, you can do whatever you want with your property, when we say you can do whatever you want. But from there, they're saying, okay, well, I'll try fishing instead, but Murray Rothbard has already claimed the ocean as his property. So, all ocean within 5 miles of the island belongs to him. So in this case, they're talking about how, basically in order for them to do that, in order for her to catch, if they want to catch fish or to get coconuts, they would essentially have to lend them, a percentage of it. So basically, Ayn Rand says, okay, you can get some coconuts out of my tree if you want, but I will charge you, you can actually keep 20% of what you keep, and I'll take the other 80%. Obviously supposed to be, an exploitative, transaction here. So then Murray Rothbard says, well, I'll actually one-up you, and if you work for my fishing depot, you'll actually be able to keep 22% of the fish you catch. So, and they talk about how, this is the beauty of, the free market competition here, because this ensures that everybody gets what they want. And so they say, well, we can try to trade with you or barter in this case. So let's say... So if they want to go fishing, then he says, okay, Rothbard says, okay, but unfortunately Ayn Rand owns all the fishing spears. So they want to go get the fishing spears. He says, oh, that's okay. I'll just trade this for all the brandy that Karl Marx has. So finally, when they say that, he doesn't want to give that up, he declares a communist revolution and says that from now on, all the private property on the island belongs to them. And, when Murray Rothbard asks, well, what about the brandy? He says, well, this is where the difference between personal property and private property comes from. And that's basically it for the comic. Now, right off the bat, I don't understand why Karl Marx was in this comic to begin with. I feel like Proudhon would have probably made more sense, since I know Karl Marx tended to advocate more of a state as a means for accomplishing his goals. But right off the bat, I do see some particular issues here, but I want to get your take on, this particular example.
Yeah, sure. So, just like you said, this is taken at its core. This is pretty much the same thing as the Coconut Island thing. If we assume that Rothbard and Rand in this situation, had actually homesteaded the things that they're claiming, then it's the same thing, And it's not really an argument against private property so much as it is, this makes me feel bad that Karl Marx can't eat, so therefore he's allowed to just take everything that he wants, right? But then to to elaborate even further, I mean, when Ayn Rand says, I claim all the coconut trees, and Murray Rothbard says, I have all the oceans, well, did they go out and homestead it, or did they just say it by verbal decree? Because if they just say, you know, I own it, that doesn't make them own it. In the same sense that if I stand on the earth and I say, I own all the earth, that's not preventing conflict in any way. You haven't homesteaded the earth. You didn't homestead that mountain that you're claiming. Exactly. And this is what the state does, right? The state will literally just say, I own that mountain range, and if you go on it, well then, you know, then I get to punish you or whatever. I own this nature reserve now, so you go on this, you know, piece of unclaimed land and you try to homestead it. Well, that's actually my property. No, that's totally illegitimate. What they have to do is actually border some specific piece of property and say, and it basically, as Hoppe and Kinsella described, that it has to be, you know, intersubjectively ascertainable that that is, you know, your land. You can't just say it. That doesn't, you know, provide a link from you to that property.
So basically, you know, one thing that also kind of strikes me as funny about this particular comic is just the way it portrays, you know, the free market competition, where Ayn Rand says, you know, you can keep 20% of the coconuts you get for me, and then Murray Rothbard outbids her with, well, you can have 22% of the fish you catch for me, and then she just goes, all right, I give up. You know, that's all I can do. It just seems kind of silly. You'd think they try to, in a free market, competition, they try to bid up a little more than that, especially for such a rate that's as, you know, absurd as that one. But,
well, I mean, just to take the hypothetical at its, you know, at its base, it's possible that, for example, you know, it could be that Murray Rothbard in this situation, he, the costs that he perceives that he would have to take if he were to offer 22% of whatever his, you know, fishery or whatever, that might be worth it to him, but not to Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, even though it's the same, you know, amount, let's just take it, for example, let's say, you know, Rothbard and Rand have the same amount of, you know, gold ounces in, you know, a circumstance. They both have 10 gold ounces, and somebody is coming to them with a whole bunch of wood that they gathered, and they're trying to sell the wood to Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard. It's conceivable that Murray Rothbard, you know, that Ayn Rand says, you know, I'll take it for 4 gold ounces, and then Rothbard says, well, I'll take it for 4.5, and then Rand goes, all right, I'm out. It's possible, even though that seems like a minor difference. That's generally what we call like the marginal buyer, basically. So Ayn Rand was lost when that price, you know, rose. So Ayn Rand was not willing to purchase. She didn't perceive that 5 or 4.5 gold ounces was worth less to her than that wood, so she dropped it. She dropped the exchange altogether, whereas Rothbard believes that the wood is worth more to him than the gold that he would have given up. So that's possible. I don't think that's the worst thing with the analogy, so much as it, again, as it is just an appeal to feelings.
So yeah, I mean, basically that's just the response of Liberty Island. So yeah, basically, even if they try to tweak the Coconut Island, you know, example there, it seems as though the same flaws still remain either way. Now, one example I've been kind of curious about, though, as an argument that I've heard used against anarcho-capitalism, is actually the oil industry. You know, I've seen some people they'll talk about how in the case of, you know, we have, you know, organizations such as OPEC, which is, I've noticed, is very ironically headquartered in Austria, of all places, despite Austria not actually being part of OPEC. So they'll basically say that because we have this, you know, company here, well, not so much company, because we have these countries here, they all have to work together to, you know, regulate the oil industry because, you know, first of all, you know, oil tends to be a lot more, you know, common in certain areas of the world, you know, primarily the Middle East. So yes, in the case of OPEC, you know, they'll be, you know, controlling the oil here for apparently for the good of our society, ostensibly, but they'll be. And some people will be saying, if you call for anarcho-capitalism, that would necessarily mean you'd have to be calling for the abolition of OPEC. And I'm curious what your response would be to this particular type of example, because the oil industry is often cited as more of a complex issue, you know, in the way that would work. And some people doubt that the free market could handle, you know, such a task all by itself.
Yeah. So this argument can take multiple forms, right? But primarily is if that has government involvement, then, and, you know, government involvement is what keeps the cartel going, then yeah, it would have to be abolished. But if not, if it is totally voluntary, and I don't know enough about it to say, then no, it doesn't have to be. See, people usually use this, and I'm assuming what you're going for here is sort of the natural monopoly argument, right? That there's a resource or whatever, like say take an electric company, and this electric company, if they were to, you know, be put into free market competition, what'll happen is you'll have you'll have tons of like electric wiring laying everywhere, and it wouldn't be sustainable at all. We have to basically have one company that funds everything. But the problem with that, of course, is, well, if you have one electric company per neighborhood, what's to stop them from just raising prices like crazy? So we have to get the government involved and basically say, well, competition is too bad in this circumstance. So we have to put, an electric company or an oil company here, and this will be the sole producer of it. But we're also going to regulate its price. So that way it can't just, charge you so much. And this comes from the general basis for that sort of argument. Well, first of all, is that kind of right? Is that what you're going for here?
Right. Yes, exactly.
Okay. So then the basis for this argument, the economic basis anyway, kind of lies with the neoclassicals, is that if you have a fixed cost, and how it works is a fixed cost curve, they say it's just decreasing over time. So obviously fixed costs is, I pay it once and then I'll never have to pay it again. And that's different from variable costs, where I might have to pay a certain amount per, month or whatever, and that can raise or stabilize or whatever. And I think the problem with natural monopolies is that the average total costs, because of its extremely high fixed costs but very low variable costs, makes getting into the business very, very hard. But once you're in it, it basically solidifies its existence for you for a period. So, for example, take electric towers. It might be super expensive for me to build electric towers, but as soon as I have them up, keeping them running is very, very cheap. So the first company to do that is basically going to achieve a monopoly immediately. And that's partially for a reason, because it wouldn't be super efficient to have a whole bunch of electric towers everywhere, supplying, or cell phone towers supplying, phone signals to everybody. But this makes it easy for a company to just, raise the rates like crazy, and then no business can really get in because the fixed costs are way too high. And the problem with this, and Rothbard lays it out in Man, Economy, and State, is that these analyses of monopolies based on cost curves are totally arbitrary. So what they'll do is they'll say fixed costs, how long are they fixed for? Well, it's not clear, because, rent and land prices, although they may not change for, a certain period of time, over time they certainly will. I mean, if you take a long enough time horizon, the prices on certain goods will change based on people's personal utility scales and their own, time preferences and such other individual subjective values. They may not change as quickly as, the cost of a washing machine or the cost of, upkeep on electricity or whatever, but they certainly will change. So what the economists have to do when they justify these monopolies or the existence of these natural monopolies is they just posit an arbitrary time frame. They just say, over this period of time, costs are fixed. These fixed costs stay the same, and the variable costs change. And then that's how they justify the existence of a monopoly. And I know that's a little bit technical and probably not something that most people would get. But if you're curious about that explanation, read Man, Economy, and State. But a little bit more of a better explanation, or a more general, I guess, layman explanation, is you have these companies, like say OPEC, for example. Why is it not good that they, jack prices up? It may be that those resources are so in demand and need to be spread out thinly across society. That's the purpose of high prices in the first place. But it could also be that those prices don't actually, that they're not worth it at that high price, so people won't buy it. It's still just as subject to market forces as everything else. Does that make sense? Did I explain that well enough?
Yes, I see what you're saying, yes.
Okay.
So, basically, yes, oil can be a bit of a complicated field, but, even then, it still doesn't necessitate the presence of a state. So, and another example I was thinking of as well, which some people might say that this one, due to its very nature, they might say that this is a pretty common example I've seen used. The topic of nuclear weapons. They'll say that, some people might allege that, maybe anarcho-capitalism could have worked a long time ago, but not today, because we live in a nuclear age. So, they're going to ask, what would be stopping some private citizen, some angry physicist who, had a hard time in high school or something, from just nuking the entire planet?
Yeah, well, ultimately they're right. Nothing is going to stop a physicist from doing it, in the same sense that nothing stops Kim Jong-un from bombing the entire planet right now. The thing is that private individuals have more restraints than the state does in the first place. Like, nothing stops a random, terrorist from exploding a whole bunch of people, and nothing stops the government from, killing a bunch of pregnant people inside of something that they'll label a cult, like in Waco, Texas or whatever, right? The thing is, the government, they don't have any real reason not to, bomb people. Like, let's take the nukes question out of it for a second and just, do something a little less dangerous. Like, say drone bombings, right? You don't have private citizens going around bombing people, and maybe, you might say, well, people, they're not allowed to. Their government's going to stop them. Well, take a look at, what the state does, what the U.S. state does in, Pakistan and Afghanistan, what they did in Libya, all these other military interventions that the state has gotten itself involved in. They care very little about civilian casualties, and they have no reason to care at all about civilian casualties because they're not bearing the costs of it. They know that whenever they go to war or they just start bombing people indiscriminately, that they can rely on either tax funds that they can just take from people illegitimately, so they don't have to produce anything, or they can just borrow like crazy because the Federal Reserve, they know that they're covered on whatever borrowing that they'll do. So they don't have to bear the costs. Whereas in agency, for example, in an anarcho-capitalist society, in order to just indiscriminately bomb people, first of all, people are not going to trust a corporation like that. People barely trust, corporations like Walmart and Target to provide them things that they want. But they're totally fine trusting the government and, purchasing these massive amounts of weapons and then bombing people overseas because, they're the state or in the case of the vaccines, I don't know where you stand on this. This isn't.
Oh, well, I'm not vaccinated myself.
Okay, or the FDA or whatever. I'll just take the FDA. People are totally fine saying, yes, the FDA, they'll regulate my food consumption, like, perfectly. They're great. They may be a little bit inefficient, but ultimately we need them. But they won't trust, a private corporation to give them TVs at a good price. Like, you have these people call, like, customer service managers all the time over the smallest details. But, the FDA, whatever, if they allow, a certain amount of rat feces in my food, who cares? Or the food pyramid or whatever. But ultimately, the main difference is private individuals have a reason not to go to war, and that's because there are a lot of costs associated in doing that. But that doesn't prevent some random psychopath from doing it, just as it doesn't prevent some random psychopath in a state society from doing the exact same thing. There's no... I can't guarantee you that there won't be some horrible terrorist attack, just like I can't guarantee you that there won't be some horrible terrorist attack on their governments. All I can say is that it's less likely to occur under a private property anarchy than it is a state-run, monopolized society.
Right. Yeah, that's very well put. In this case, I think a lot of the concerns surrounding, nuclear weapons, I can understand definitely being concerned about that, but I don't see how, anarcho-capitalism would necessarily make that any more of a likely outcome than, under a state. Because once again, we run into the same issue of giving the state a forceful monopoly over nuclear weapons. That doesn't eliminate their threat at all. In fact, if we look at, the international relations we're seeing, if anything, they're only serving to exacerbate that and make it worse.
Exactly.
So I definitely don't think that that's a good art. I don't think that's by no means the death shot against anarcho-capitalism here. One example, though, I do see, frequently is where people will talk about law, the idea of, prisons, courts, for example, some people will recognize that as horrendous as, the prison system currently is under the government, a lot of people will defend the system because, there are some horrible, despicable people out there, and just to feel safe against them and to feel secure, they want some type of social mechanism in place that's going to deter them from committing crimes. And if this system currently serves, this system would have to serve to make potential criminals afraid of the punishment they would hypothetically receive, so that logically they would understand, okay, if I commit this crime, I'm going to get something I certainly don't want to happen out of it, so therefore I won't commit it. And I feel like they're a bit concerned how an anarcho-capitalist society would respond to this, or if they would have a mechanism in place that could sufficiently do this to prevent, potential criminals from committing these acts.
Right. So insofar as it's demanded, my first response is it would exist. So if you want, like, for example, nobody wants serial killers running around, right? Like, nobody wants to live next to a serial killer. So, of course, there's going to be a business that will arise to solve that demand. Like, for example, and the example that Hoppe might use, or that Bob Murphy would use, is you'd have insurance companies, right? And there's a little bit. First of all, I do want to put a little bit of a disclaimer that there's no 100% accurate answer to say that like this is how it would work in an anarcho-capitalist society. There's no, unlike, you know, in a state society, what people really want is, because they're so used to a state, is they want an answer to how is this going to happen. In the same sense, like if we were living in the Soviet Union right now, and you know, the government controls food production, and I come to you and I say, you know, I don't think the government should be making our food. Look, we're, you know, miles out this bread line, and all we get is like a piece of, you know, stale bread and soup with rotten meat in it or whatever. And they go, well, then who else is going to do it? I don't see a, you know, an issue. I don't see a solution. How would you run it? And it's like, well, I don't know. People would figure it out. That's the whole benefit of the free market. The only problem is people don't like that as an explanation. They go, well, you must not have an answer. Well, I'm not really obligated to give one, but to entertain it, because that's not a satisfactory answer for most people, like I said, is, if it's demanded, people will cover it. But as, Hoppe and Bob Murphy would say, is you'd have insurance agencies. So if I want to be protected in my own home, what I'm going to do is there would be these massive demand for people to actually defend me, or to recoup my losses, rather. So let's take the serial killer. Let's just make it a little bit more of a petty criminal, like a thief, a TV thief. What they're going to do is they're going to come in and steal the TV from me. And I bought insurance prior to that happening. So then the insurance company would come in and recoup my losses, right, for this TV. Well, the insurance company doesn't want to pay out of their own pocket if they don't have to. So they have every incentive in the world to find the actual TV thief and to recoup the TV from them and then get the funds from them, so that the insurance company doesn't have to pay out of pocket. So what happens is you'd have these insurance companies with the incentive to actually punish and go after criminals who have wronged, you know, their clients. But further from that, people might say, you know, what if I don't have an insurance agency or whatever, right? That's possible. And ethically speaking, we can just say that TV thieves or whatever are wrong. But practically speaking, how would an anarcho-capitalist society resolve this? Is basically, it's that you would have to either go after them yourself, or you'd have to pay somebody else to do it for you. In the same sense that under a state, it's like, how could you make the conclusion that just because, you know, you couldn't potentially afford it yourself in this circumstance, or you're not willing to risk your own resources to go after this person, that therefore that you should steal from everybody else so that you can fund going after this person? How does that follow? Anyway, you can just victimize everybody else because you yourself were victimized? It doesn't really work for me. But that's the case of the thief. But then further, you can take it to violent criminals. People, like, as you said, people will say, well, I don't want these violent criminals running around, so I need a way to punish them so that they know that they can't actually commit these crimes in the future, that we're going to prevent crimes by threatening this horrible, horrible punishment. And my first argument is, well, I mean, if you're threatening punishment, you know, what is that, deterrent or whatever, that you're using punishment as a deterrent, well, shouldn't we be punishing, like, even the most petty criminals in the most severe way possible to prevent them from committing a crime? Like a bubblegum thief, for example. Should we be threatening murder over the bubblegum thief? Because then he won't commit the crime. That's probably true. Right. But, I mean, obviously, most people feel like that's unjust. And that can be proven as unjust through, you know, a series of ethical foundations. But how the market will solve it. And Bob Murphy will have this other... Bob Murphy's a pacifist, so basically he suggests that in an anarcho-capitalist world, what you'll have is voluntary prisons. So everybody is going to shun, and nobody is going to want to work with a serial killer. If somebody murders their wife, say they come home and their wife's cheating on somebody, so they go and murder their wife and whoever they're cheating with. Nobody wants to work with this person. This person is an unhinged lunatic. Why would anybody trust this person? So what's going to happen is they'll get on all these blacklists and they won't be able to work anywhere. And then you'll have businesses that want to actually take what that person could provide, and they may give them housing and shelter and whatever else to go and work for them. And they might have to, as part of the terms of their contract, they might have to stay within the bounds of a certain area, but then they can still work and provide, you know, value to people, despite the horrible crimes that they may have committed, right? And they won't be able to, you know, go out and just kill whoever they want. If that, you know, makes sense. Or you have vigilante justice in anarcho-capitalism too. Even if there's no police force that you paid for, which is ridiculous. There's no insurance company that you paid for, which is also ridiculous. There's no voluntary prisons. Like, we can take away all these things, and still it would be totally fine for you to go out and kill him if you want. But that's basically the long and short of it.
Right, exactly. You know, 'cause, I mean, the way a lot of people might present it is they're thinking, well, you know, the topic of prisons is a bit different because, you know, I mean, doesn't the criminal have their own, you know, voluntary, you know, decisions that they can make? And I mean, in a sense, yes, but there are going to be plenty of external social factors that are going to certainly impact, you know, this voluntary decision that the criminal would be making, you know, whether in the form of, like you're saying, you know, the voluntary prisons or the fact that this vigilante justice may very well be taking place. But I mean, basically, I mean, just if we look at, you know, this whole system under the state, for example, I mean, if somebody steals your, you know, your wallet, for example, and you call up the police and you want them to take action, I mean, what's really going to happen is they'll probably just take a report and then nothing's going to end up happening. But whereas, if, like I said, if we had this type of private insurance, you know, then there you'd be able to actually at least recoup what you lost. You know, there'd be, you know, some type of actual, the situation could actually be rectified to some extent because of that.
Right.
So, I mean, I think.
And under the current structure, you know, insurance agencies and especially police officers, like, for example, police stations, they have no reason to go after the actual thief. Who cares? Like, at the end of the day, they're just going to be like, well, you know, my revenue is guaranteed either way. So what does it matter? I can just go and, like, for example, under, you know, civil asset forfeiture, I can go to people who aren't really committing crimes, like they're selling drugs or whatever. And maybe, you know, they have a bunch of money in their car because they're about to take this drug deal. The police officer would rather spend their time hunting for those people because they'll get the assets that they'll get the assets that they get from arresting the drug dealer more than they would, you know, chasing some random no-name thief that they can't find. So why bother with that when I could just bother with doing more, you know, evil things like punishing drug dealers? And then insurance companies too. I mean, insurance companies are backed up all the time by, you know, huge government loans and these and banks that they are sure to be bailed out. So why would they, even though they're not even allowed to take, you know, the law into their own hands, but even if they were, why would they bother now when they're insured by the fiat system that all their losses will be recouped if they pay somebody out? Does that make sense?
Right. Yes, I see what you're saying. That makes very good sense, actually. I guess another issue I've seen people often use against anarcho-capitalism is this is a pretty common one about the monopolies will form. You know, they'll talk about how, for example, you know, they'll talk about Rockefeller, for example, breaking, you know, competitors' kneecaps and things like that as a means of getting to the top in an industry. They'll talk about cartels forming. And I personally find cartels to not be a very strong argument against anarcho-capitalism because, you know, I know Rothbard himself spoke about how, you know, whenever a cartel would form, you know, within that cartel of people who've jacked their prices up to a very high level, you know, there'd always be that one guy who there'd be some secret price cutting down there because they're thinking, you know, I got to get some of this, you know, consumer demand here. So they'll try to secretly, you know, sneak in and get business, you know, with this type of price cutting here. So I just feel like, you know, that's kind of an inaccurate example. Some people will talk about how, you know, we have antitrust laws and, you know, how we need a specific, you know, a complex system of laws in order to prevent these trusts from forming. So what would you say to people like that?
Yeah, so as you said, Rothbard has this whole chapter. It's chapter 10 of Man, Economy, and State. It's all about monopolies and cartelization and stuff like that. And it's fantastic. And basically, the main idea is, well, you know, a cartel, it's just transitory. First of all, nobody is staying in a cartel permanently. That doesn't make any sense. If the cartel ended up being good, so say you have 3 businesses, right? And they're all going to join into one business, or they sign a pact that says, you know, we're going to cut production and we're all going to sell at a high price. If that turned out to be a good thing, then they're just going to merge the businesses. Why are they going to stay in the cartel? And if that turned out to be a bad thing, then they're going to break the cartel apart. So either way, a cartel does not stay. But most people will be like, okay, fine, the second option, whatever. But the first option, what if they merge and they become, you know, one big firm? Well, are you just going to condemn mergers across the board then? Like, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because, I mean, in order to found a business, people all the time, they pool their own capital, which is just a merger between, you know, 2 individuals, for example, to start a company. Is that going to be banned? Benjamin Tucker, who was an individualist anarchist, he has this quote on it where it's like the trust is the denial of competition in no other sense than that in which competition is itself is a denial of competition. Because that's what these people will say. They'll say trusts, well, these deny competition basically by making it so that, you know, we're going to consolidate all these firms together so there's no more competition in the field anymore. Again, all that means is that somebody took what was happening before is that they were inefficient and now they're being efficient. They are rationally allocating resources that they should have been allocating previously to where people want them most. And now they're going to compete with other firms, even though they're just not, all they are is just a bigger firm. They're not like totally different in some way. And in order to, legitimately and principally reject the formation of cartels and mergers is to reject them across the board and to suggest that no merger should be possible anywhere. Nobody can merge their capital resources together at all. And any time you decide that, if 4 people merge their stuff together instead of, 20, that's just an arbitrary line. That doesn't make any sense. You have to justify it in some way or another, and they can't. They never will be able to. It's just another, nonsense scaremongering tactic that people will say, well, what if they just, form one giant big company? And then further from that, why would the cartel even form in the first place? If there's an inefficient business, they're the ones who want to form the cartel, right? If they're not making profits, what they want to do is they want to come to the other efficient businesses and say, hey, let's raise prices and restrict production, right? And then that way I can stay alive. Well, the other businesses are producing efficiently. Why would they be like, yes, let's all get together and make sure that you can be okay? No, that doesn't make any sense. What'll happen is the exact same thing that you just said. One business will say, well, if I undersell these guys, I'll be more profitable. And that's exactly what'll happen. The cartel will just completely fall apart. So.
And this kind of actually allows me to segue into my next point. In that type of example, even if there is a cartel formed and there's, let's say that they are for some reason not lowering their prices, that's going to leave the door open for any other agency that is not within that, cartel to form and naturally provide that service at a lower cost as well because of the potential competition that could arise from that. However, if the state is, let's say there's all these different regulations and licensing issues that are preventing that business from arising in the first place and favoring that other business, then that in itself could pose, a problem and could restrict competition and could actually, through the state's actions, could actually reinforce that cartel and strengthen that and in fact have, worsen the monopoly than it would have been otherwise.
Yes, exactly. This happens all the time throughout history, too. It's the state giving, random benefits to people that are keeping monopolies up. It's not the existence of the free market that are doing that. These inefficient firms are being propped up artificially by guaranteed revenues that the state can provide them. Right,
exactly. And so as far as licensing issues, I'm curious what your take would be on this. Because I've seen like this, people often use this as an example. I mean, the way I see it, we can kind of break, licenses down into multiple categories here. We have, the driver's license, issue here. People say, well, you should have a license to drive. And, I would agree that you should have definitely some type of qualification if someone's going to let you ride on their roads. But I don't see why that license should be granted to you by a state, because the state, I say, does not have a legitimate ownership over the roads themselves. Or, if you're getting a hunting license or a fishing license or things like that, I mean, I feel like we could have, more of a private licensing agencies in that case. But then there's an issue more of occupational licenses, for example. Let's say you go to a barber, for example. I mean, you don't want some maniac who's going to, just, give you a shave and, cut your throat while he's doing it in some fit. You want to have somebody who's established that they are sane and, able to perform this task. So basically, I'm curious what your take is on licenses and that do you believe they should be privatized, or do you think there are too many licenses currently? I mean, the system, is obviously very inefficient, but I'm curious how your optimal, system would run to essentially vet these people and to preserve, the high quality goods and services.
Yeah, so the same thing with basically all these arguments. Like it's the same thing as like the FDA and private regulators, for instance. Insofar as it's demanded, there will be private licenses. So if, for example, if you don't just want random people going and driving on the roads or whatever, if they don't, know how to operate a vehicle, well, then certain road owners or private road owners will say, look, if you drive on our roads, we can say that everybody on our roads are licensed with such and such licensure or whatever. And those firms will tend to consolidate, and there will only be a few of them so that people don't have to keep track of what licenses are where. And that'll just be kind of how that forms. But the problem with government licenses, just as with private regulations, is how do you know which license rules are better? Like, even if we take the most, even if we say that all government officials, they really mean the best, what knowledge do they have access to know that, such and such worker registry or such and such worker license requirements are the ones that are best for that industry? What if the workers, the licenses that they put on, say driving regulations, if let's just say they require drivers to be 21 and up, well, how do you know that that's beneficial? Like, why wouldn't it be better Isn't it possible that if you drop the age a few years, that you could have more people on the roads and working longer distance jobs, for instance, that may be more demanded? Like, so that I could go and drive somewhere and provide services somewhere farther away from where I currently am. But if you impose an artificial license on that and you just say, well, you know, we say 21 is the time at which you can drive, you're just eliminating a huge labor pool for nothing, just for totally arbitrary reasons. It might be totally fine for an 18-year-old to drive, but there's no way the government could possibly know that because, again, just like with the situation of private regulators, is there is no alternative. So they don't know. There's no way to possibly know what the most efficient allocation of resources is and what the best rules are for such and such license, just as there isn't one for such and such, you know, private regulation. And if this will happen with doctors too all the time, is you'll have a doctor's licensure. Well, why would a hospital hire a doctor who's totally, you know, incompetent? Nobody's going to go to a hospital where the surgeon is going to kill them, has like a 90% chance to kill them, right? But with the government, they might end up going to one of these hospitals because better doctors weren't able to get, you know, whatever license registration. Or maybe even worse, people will talk about like hospital fees and stuff like that. Well, if you drop, you know, license registration, it might be more dangerous for you to go to a cheaper doctor, but it's cheaper. Maybe you'll have a chance to live instead of no chance at all. Like, people, either way, people will choose on what they think is best for them. If they want to go for a lower quality item, then that's totally fine. Why are you preventing them from doing that arbitrarily? Because the government wants to step in and regulate what's appropriate for you. It's total nonsense.
Right, exactly. And we saw that pretty much in actual practice when we talk about the fraternal lodges from back in the day, you know, where we'd have, you know, a lot of this cheaper healthcare. But as the government went in and tried to essentially demonize these lodge doctors, presenting them as quacks and, you know, passing their own legislations and things like that, that basically, you know, I would say was probably the first step towards this horrible, you know, healthcare situation we have currently as far as costs and, you know, the way that's set up. So, I mean, we can really point to the government
Right.
as the problem there. I don't see, you know, so a lot of people talking about, you know, putting the government in control of healthcare. I see that as the exact opposite of what should be done in this particular, you know, situation.
Right. And the
So,
other problem
yes,
is,
I mean,
like, we can assume that they won't have the best intentions too. Like, assuming they have the best intentions, things are still pretty bad. But now assume what's really more accurate, and that people have self-interest. So what's going to happen is that people who are, you know, appointed to these random boards that approve doctors, for instance, why? Of course, they're going to let their friends in before other people. They are going to be bribed effectively, or, you know, have their own ideological, you know, requirements over, you know, such and such licensure. And they'll let people closer to them in before they let, you know, a more competent doctor in, because they're the ones who are given sole monopoly authority to determine who's allowed to have a license and who isn't. It doesn't matter what regulations you put on them to try to prevent that. It's going to get around it in some way because the monopoly exists. There's no way to actually break it. There is no alternative, and that's the key.
Right. You know, I mean, that kind of reminds me of, I don't know who exactly this was, but I did hear about this case where there was some court justice who was, you know, caught driving drunk by a police officer. And, you know, when they were pulling them over, they told them, you know, they bragged about their position as a court justice. And, you know, so because of that, the police officer just let them go on their own, you know, on their own merry way. And, you know, eventually, fortunately, they were caught by another police officer, I believe, who actually did, you know, follow through on it. But it really goes to show how, I mean, if we lived in a society where each of these organizations were privatized, there would be no incentive for these people to be like, oh, well, this guy's pretty important, we should just let him go. I mean, he's got all this status. I mean, it's pretty absurd in the first place to even let that happen. And I would say that is a direct result of, you know, this current system that we have of the state control.
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard of this, but there are people who are like, on like TikTok and stuff, people will say that they purposefully put, you know, like Blue Lives Matter stickers or whatever on the back of their car because apparently it makes them like less likely to be pulled over if they're speeding or whatever. Which, I mean, I don't know how true that is, but I buy it. I mean, if you're ideologically supporting cops, why would the cop come and stop you then? Like, of course, they're probably going to be nicer to you or whatever because they don't have any like actual market reason to care. It's just, and they're going to be more hostile to people who are against them than the people who are for them. Whereas a private company, on the other hand, their reputation is ruined if they do stuff like that. If they give special treatment to other people, people will choose something else. Well, they can't in terms of the police. They're stuck with what they have. So if they have to appeal to these people on a personal basis, and what'll happen, of course, in more like severe societies is like, take the Soviet Union. You'll have people have to. The people who will do the best are the people with the most money who can afford to bribe the government officials into getting what they want. Whereas with private companies, bribery destroys their reputation. They don't want to accept bribes. But anyway.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. I mean, and I just kind of think too of, a few years ago when we had, the George Floyd protests, those protests, as far as I'm saying, were a direct result of statism, because in this case, I mean, whereas in an anarcho-capitalist society, let's say that this is a completely legitimate case of this police brutality here, that police agency would pretty much be toast at that point, after something like that. But instead, because we have this, state monopoly over the law in this case, over law enforcement, all we have are just these people, going crazy out in the streets, all these acts of absurd violence. And it's just really out of a complete impotence, really, because they can't really affect much change under this type of state monopoly. So I just see that is all the more reason that, a lot of these people who participated in those riots as well would probably be very much, they're probably Antifa, they might be parts of this organization, but in any case, they would be opposed to anarcho-capitalism, which I think is ironic because anarcho-capitalism could be the best ideology for what the type of change that they're trying to actually implement in society.
Yeah, I just don't. I don't know if that's the change that they're really trying to implement. To be honest, like I think it's just like the
I might be giving
the anarcho-communist or whatever, who like claim they're like anarchists or whatever. They're usually not. Like these people are like, yeah, we should abolish the IRS. No, you can't do that. You can't. Or no, Chomsky. No, you can't deregulate. This industry. That's horrible. We need more government, not less. And yes, I am an anarchist. Like, no, shut up. That doesn't. Yeah. No, you're not. You want to just terrorize people. And this is part of the problem. This raises another issue with police, is you'll notice they'll be like really brutal and rude to otherwise, peaceful people because they're not going to get, any resistance from them. But the moment people do like resist or whatever, the politicians or whatever, they'll just hold the police back and be like, yeah, the police, they're not. Or let's take the incidents of all these riots, right? And these people totally destroying private property, like people raiding a Target or whatever because of police brutality protests. Like that makes any sense. So they go and raid this Target and the police are all told to step back. Well, there's no other option. So like if the police are told to step back, I can't go out there and enact vigilante justice or I'm going to be the one put in trouble. Like there are so many issues. You get total incompetence in areas where they need to be competent. In both scenarios. You either get them not acting in areas where they need to act, or you get their action in areas where they shouldn't be acting at all. Like take the school shooting, for example, in Texas. They just don't go in after like hours or whatever, just because, over whatever. They don't have to compete against anybody else. Nobody else is going to offer the service or is allowed to offer the service that they're offering.
Exactly. They have the killer in the school, and the police are basically just saying, just let us know when you're finished in there. It's just not an acceptable situation, really. And,
exactly. I should say, it could be correct. Maybe going in there would have been a bad decision or whatever. It could be. It's conceivable that going in there may have caused more people to die. The problem is, just like everything else, we can't know that because there's no alternative. We don't know what the other situation is because nobody else could possibly go in there and do something different.
Exactly, and I mean, what's funny too is that this is actually just happened to me just the other day, where my family had somebody from the state electric company coming in, and checking on our water heater. So he comes in and he talks about how, well, the way this water heater is established here, it's amazing that this whole family didn't die from carbon monoxide poisoning. So I'm going to have to cut off all your, connection to hot water. It's just not going to be good. We just can't do that anymore. We got to get this whole water heater removed and replaced. So immediately after that, we call up the landlord and have them, send out a private, plumber. He comes out and he talks about how he takes a look at it and says, okay, that first guy was a complete idiot. He didn't know what he was talking about at all. These people, they get a 2-month crediting course, and they think they know more than people like me who get this, who have 10 year training, 10 years of training here. He's talking about how, first of all, the carbon monoxide detector is 10 feet away. It's perfectly running. So there's no way that this would have killed you. I mean, that's insane. In fact, this type of situation that he's describing is completely unprecedented. There's no way it could have happened. And so he immediately put the hot water back on. But it just goes to show, how we can see, the public versus the private sector, right up next to each other. And we can see how people can argue over which one is, objectively better, but it goes to show that there is definitely a difference between the two. I mean, there certainly is some disagreement here in the way that the two are run.
Like, imagine if you take that situation that you're describing and apply it to just like the judicial system. Well, if installing a water heater, if these people are so incompetent, what about people locking people up and, putting them into to death? Like, what, these people are suddenly competent, but the guys who, understand the water heater are not? No, these police officers, these judges, they're just as incompetent as this random inspector, and probably far more consequential and life-destroying.
I've noticed that a lot of people, too, they tend to approach things, I think, in a superficial way. So if you tell them, that you're endorsing, no government, they tend to have this kind of visceral, knee-jerk reaction to it. Where it's, they're very much against it. But if you tell them that, hey, I support a completely decentralized society, they might be like, oh yeah, that sounds like a pretty good idea, even though what you're describing are basically the same thing here. I think a lot of this comes down to kind of a misunderstanding of what government really entails. So, for example, if I wake up in the morning and I decide to brush my teeth, that's an act of government. It's self-government in a sense here. It's government on the level of the individual, right? If you have a goal to be, let's say you want to be physically fit and you're out of shape or something, you might set that as your project, the way the current state might set a project. But in that case, you would direct your own personal resources toward achieving that goal in the form of, let's say, you might invest your money towards healthier foods. You might invest your time into a gym membership. But basically, the point I'm making here is that this is still a form of government. It's just that it's government on the level of the individual. So it seems almost as though being an anarcho-capitalist, it's not even about being against government per se, but rather against one entity making choices for other entities or individuals. And we see this a lot with the state. We see this with central planning, where basically we have these people, determining, okay, this is what's going to happen here. This is what we're going to do now. Your money is going to be put towards this end. It's going to be put towards that end. It doesn't matter if you agree with what this end is. We're just going to do it anyway. So it just seems like a very inefficient way to run any system here.
Right. And I mean, a lot of this has to do with like semantics, and people will, and I think it's a big language game. Jeff Deist, who's the president of the Mises Institute, he had a big talk, and he's released, lectures on how, people have changed language. Like, for example, you'll hear, and this is something he points out in that essay, is like, you hear this democracy all the time, like, we need to save our democracy or whatever, but people don't really know what that is. Like, some people will say voting, some people will say like public representation, but not everybody's like pro total democracy. People don't want to vote. People don't think that, if the majority of people get together and vote that, such and such can be raped by the majority, just totally, gangbanged. If 10 people get together and 6 people vote that the other 4 should be raped, people will say, well, that's unjust. Because they don't actually believe in democracy as a principle. They just believe that democracy should solve some of the issues that they are not super, nice on. But further, it goes with this government charge and like what government should do. The problem is people conflate rules with rulers. Like, they think that an arbitrary ruler imposes the rules because we need rules. Why do we need an arbitrary ruler to do that? Why can't we, do this voluntarily? People don't, like you said, like with, brushing your teeth or whatever, or in the example of like, I want to go live in a community with certain rules, or Hoppus covenant communities, whether, you're for them or not, is, you go into like a housing development, and those people will say, if you want to buy a house here, you have to do such and such. You can't have, your lawn super, unkempt or whatever. You can't have, such and such, measurements of shed or whatever, or else you don't live here, right? Those are still rules. They're just not imposed artificially on you on stuff that, property that's yours. Like, if I already have a house, why should the government be able to tell me, you can't snort cocaine in your house? Why? Like, that's totally arbitrary. That's total nonsense, right? But it's still technically a rule. And that's the problem with all these semantic stuff, is you'll get this, like the social contract. You'll hear this all the time from people. Government is legitimate because, we all signed a social contract. Well, I mean, the first response is, what contract? I didn't sign anything. Yeah. Random people came up and signed stuff for me, right? But people like get this in their head because they hear the word social contract, that it must be voluntary. but it's not really voluntary, and they know it's not really voluntary, but they still say it's voluntary, right? They conflate all these concepts into one thing in order to try to justify this artificial imposition of force onto other people. But that's kind of the long and short of it.
Exactly. I know exactly what you mean. You know, I mean, when I, for example, when I'm driving and I see somebody with the bumper stickers that say, you know, America, love it or leave it. I mean, I don't know if it, in this current context of, you know, the way our, you know, the status system we currently live in, I don't know if it's quite as simple as they're presenting that. I mean, you know, there's also the solution of, you know, trying to improve flaws where there are in this case. But, you know, that's just
it's because, like, yeah, it's the same thing, though. They conflate, because it's totally legitimate. For example, people will say that if you have, and this is the thing that communists might raise, they'll say, well, anarcho-capitalists, you say that, you know, a state saying that you should leave if you don't like it is illegitimate. Why is it legitimate for a boss to say that to you? Well, it's because a boss legitimately owns his property. He's done something with it. He's produced something with it. He's created something, right? He's gained it for himself. And this is what other people will do to say the state is in fact legitimate, is they'll conflate legitimate ownership with illegitimate ownership and say, yes, well, the state, you know, this boss, I can be fired because, you know, my company is owned by somebody, so that's totally legitimate. And the state owns all this land, so whatever rules they say, they're legitimate, and if you don't like it, just leave. Well, it's the same sense, like, if a mafia comes, say you're living in your house, right, and 20 people come up to you, and they say, give us your house, or, you know, you're going to give us 20% of your income, and if you don't like it, leave. Well, most people go, that's totally ridiculous. Like, that's completely wrong. This is my house. I worked for it. I built it. Why do you just get to come in and tell me? Like, just saying you get to leave is not a legitimate excuse because you didn't actually own the land. And that's the key categorical difference between those two scenarios.
You know, and some people try to discuss, you know, what truly separates somebody as a legitimate owner or an illegitimate owner. And I feel like that's kind of where people will try to use, where the semantics come in. People might try to twist, you know, certain words such as legitimacy or the concept of freedom itself to suit their own ends. So what do you think would be the best, you know, what do you think, well, what is the anarcho-capitalist, you know, means exactly of very clearly establishing what would make something a legitimate owner, whereas the state is an illegitimate owner?
Well, the idea is there's two things, and this can kind of be this is a little bit confusing because people will often say that you have to mix you know, your labor with land, because that kind of came from John Locke, but I don't think that's true so much as it is you just have to border it. You basically have to make a clear and ascertainable distinction between what you have claimed as your means from what other people have claimed. So you have to mix, or you have to you know, change nature in some way to show that you were there and that you did something with it. It's not like 100%, you know, what is it? It's not super rigorous, but generally the idea is if I'm using something as a means to an end and then you come across and use it afterwards, it doesn't really matter how I established it so much as I did establish it, if that makes sense. So we can take this scenario comes in. Basically what I'm saying is that this problem comes in two different forms. The first thing is, well, how do I know that you've established it? And how do I establish it? Well, how you establish it is just you use it in some way. But how do I know you established it is, you know, I should do something with it so that you know that I've established it, right? Does that make sense? Is that
right? I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying.
Okay.
Yes, I understand. And I feel like you will see this in some type of, you know, left-wing anarchist ideologies, but I think they'll take what you're saying and they kind of pervert it in a way where they say, you know, private property, well, basically, it's almost as though if somebody's not using something, it becomes some type of property and it becomes free to them to take.
Yeah.
I've heard,
the mutualists will say.
I mean, I don't, right, yes, I don't know if I was botching the idea there, but basically just that if somebody's not using it, then it essentially becomes, you know, a public good or something like that.
Yeah, this is what the mutualists will argue, that, like, this came from Proudhon, right? That everything is, that you have legitimate property until, you know, you stop using it. So, you know, the problem with this argument is, what about storage? What if I'm just using it as storage? Like, even on their own grounds, it doesn't make any sense. Like if I have a shovel, right, and I decide and I'm employing it as a means to dig a hole, the mutualist will say, yes, well, I can't use that. That's your property. You're using it at the time. So I can't just come and steal it. But if I just, put it in my house or whatever, and then I leave my house for a period of time, well, is that abandoned? Like I'm just storing I'm storing the shovel. I am still using it. I'm just not, physically using it for a purpose that you see. So even on their own terms, it doesn't make any sense.
Right. I mean, that train of logic, it reminds me of this episode of The Simpsons I saw once where, Homer comes in with, this life jacket and this bullhorn. He says, I just found all these things lying around in somebody's boat at the marina.
Yeah. Yes, I just found this, or somebody's house. I mean, they leave their house to go to work. It's like, oh, well, this house is now mine. It's totally abandoned. Well, no, I left for like 5 minutes or whatever. Like I went outside for a little bit.
Right. So I guess, moving forward from here, what do you think we can do to actually bring about the society that you're calling for? I mean, I know agorism is a pretty good method of resisting the state, but I wasn't sure what you would recommend in particular to do this.
I mean, personally, and this is a disclaimer, I don't really care. Like, I mean, and I know that's not super satisfying, but people will say, like, we should use, the Libertarian Party, or we should use the Libertarian Party and the Mises Caucus to change a whole bunch of people's minds or whatever. Or we should, use the Republican Party and get in office and get locally elected so that you can change, zoning laws in whatever, city that you live in. Or we should use, agorist stuff. Like you should be buying things on the black or gray market or whatever, and not purposefully trying to avoid as much taxes as you can. And some people will say like seasteading or, whatever. And honestly, all of those things are fine in and of themselves. I don't think the political ones are that great. And honestly, I don't think agorism is that great and will do anything, because I think that the state is just going to fall apart on its own, probably over time, so long as technology develops. The state is, the thing with the state is that it's inherently unstable, because the state produces, like we were talking about before, it rewards unproductive people at the expense of productive people. That's how they live. The thing is, at a certain point, you get too many unproductive people than there are productive people. It's like what happens when you have a parasite, and the parasite, reproduces, and then it accidentally kills its host, right? If you keep creating parasites, you will kill your host, and that's what the state does, and especially democracy, right? So eventually the state is going to fall apart on its own, and it depends on what's going to replace it. Is it going to be something worse or better? Well, the thing with getting somewhere better is, I think the best strategy is probably just, use Bitcoin, basically. I think Bitcoin is pretty damn great. Especially because the thing is with the state is that it kind of has to fund itself. It's relied on fiat money. If the Federal Reserve, for example, disappeared today, it wouldn't be able to fund, a quarter or a fifth of the things that it funds today, right? Because it relies so heavily on borrowing in order to fund its massive, machinations. Before, they were able to just, lend out whatever. Wars were a lot less common, right? But now, the government can fund these massive expeditions off of purely nothing, because they have the guarantee by the Federal Reserve, which is a bank that cannot go bankrupt, to give them whatever funds they need, or Boeing whatever funds they need to build, these massive amounts of planes and take away from society. The thing is, in order to cripple the government, you kind of want to cripple its source of funding. And I mean, crippling the Fed is the best way to do that. I don't think there's any chance that they go back on a gold standard, because if they were to, they would be so restrained by certain forces that they couldn't fund the massive projects that they currently fund. And the best way to do that is just, Bitcoin isn't really that restrictable by the state. What they can do is they can ban mining, which is what China did. But even so, they can go other places in order to mine. And at a certain point, I have a Bitcoin wallet or whatever. The state can't do anything about it. They don't know anything about me. All they know is that, I have a ledger. I have funds attributed to some public address that they don't know, maybe multiple, and they've got no way to access that. They don't know who is actually behind it. I could have these devices everywhere, and they have no way of actually confiscating the funds without knowing the actual password, right? Unless they want to shut down the entire internet. Like, there's no way to stop it, really. So if you want to get around it, I would adopt Bitcoin. And if people do that on a mass scale, then there's no way the state can come in and really and print. They might be able to figure out a way to tax it somehow. But that's, again, a lot less dangerous than working on this fiat fractional reserve system. It totally gets rid of the need for fraudulent banks and borrowing and all this stuff. And then the state can, slowly wither away as people find better and better ways to do things that the state currently says is necessary for them to do. So kind of the long and short of it.
Right, exactly. Exactly. That's actually what I was thinking. I was thinking myself, about how I try to be, optimistic about our future. And I was even saying, I guess at the dinner table the other night about how I think that, believe in a very roundabout sort of way, I think we are working towards something close to anarcho-capitalism, because I believe that eventually authoritarianism is just going to implode on itself. I don't believe that, this type of society that we're seeing now can really sustain itself, and it's eventually going to work against itself. So, but I do have my concerns as well, because, for example, when we saw, the COVID pandemic, the way people responded to that was just not very encouraging. They tended to kind of just go along with whatever the state was telling them. Not everybody, obviously, but there was a large portion of people who, didn't provide any, real pushback.
Right.
And,
I see this all the time, but I don't have that much faith in people in general. But right. I do think that, if it's widespread enough that people don't need the state anymore, like they don't perceive to need it, then they won't care for it. If the state doesn't provide anything for them anymore, like, for example, fiat money, well, then if they don't need to use it, well, then the state's, relevancy kind of disappears on its own without people having to get, ideological or believe everything that they say. So.
Right, exactly. Just a few things I want to say here, too. I would strongly recommend people read the book End the Fed by Ron Paul. That's one that I think is, provides a great, explanation there. I do think that, I would also definitely recommend, honestly, I think Dave Smith would make a great president for 2024. If he does get the nomination, I'd definitely be voting for him, hands down. And just another point I also want to make, too, is something I've always thought as well, is that a lot of people don't realize this, but our military isn't just there to fight against foreign threats to the government as well. It's for, domestic as well. But basically, in this case, I just really see the state as an issue here, whereas, for example, during the COVID, for example, we saw, all of this blatant authoritarianism, and this is the same government that, Ed Snowden, warned us about, all those years ago. Suddenly, the same government is just assuming control, telling people what to do, and they just go along with it. So, like you're saying, I definitely, would agree. I can't have much faith in people. I can, at the end of the day, I can only really have faith in myself and, as an individual. And I think that, anarcho-capitalism is the most, supportive of individualism and individual rights in that case.
I totally agree. Like Dave Smith is great. He's a lot more knowledgeable than I originally thought. Like he's pretty well read. I think he knows what he's talking about. And if he does run for president, that is probably, I might vote for him. Although I think there's obviously no way he's going to win, and he knows that. He's never going to get into office. But I support whatever he's trying to do. But again, in terms of like actual progress, just I can't say don't pay your taxes or whatever, because I would never, recommend people to do something that will put them in trouble. I think that's generally a bad idea. But and do stuff that's doing things that are totally legal, like owning Bitcoin is the thing that I have to recommend. And if you want like books on that, the Bitcoin Standard, what has government done to our money, the ethics of money production, Bob Murphy's new book on money mechanics. Joe Salerno has this book, Money, Sound and Unsound. All that stuff is absolutely fantastic on monetary theory.
Honestly, when I watch your channel and I see the intro there and I see all those books coming up, I often think, well, I've read about 40% of those. But, I definitely do have some more reading I need to do on, anarcho-capitalism overall. And I think, I definitely, some of these book recommendations are definitely something that I and, a lot of the other people in the audience should look into. So I guess, wrapping things up here, are there any final statements you'd like to make, just about, anarcho-capitalism in general, or what should be done in regards to, this ideology?
In order to be an anarcho-capitalist or whatever, you don't have to get involved politically. You don't have to get involved in the Libertarian or Republican Party or whatever. You don't even have to like read all that much. You don't have to be like me and sit in your room and read, monetary theory, for hours a day. That's not required or anything. All you got to know is just like, this sounds basic, but don't hurt other people. And you should just advocate the same thing and just know that the government's sole job is to hurt other people. And that's why we want it to be abolished. The idea behind anarcho-capitalism as some people think, is that we want to abolish the state, and that therefore everything else follows from that. But that's not really true. We just don't want to hurt other people, and we see the state as the sole, or as the most popular institution in society that harms other people, and that's why we want to get rid of it, right? We don't take this random idea that the state should be abolished first. But further from that, if you want to know more about it, I would just read, which again, you're under no obligation to read, but if you want anything on economics, on ethics, on political philosophy, on monetary theory, all of that there are tons and tons of books that you can get from the Mises Institute to make yourself a more, well-rounded and knowledgeable individual. And this is going to sound the last thing, this is going to sound a little bit counterintuitive, but I would not take all of your, knowledge from YouTubers alone, because YouTubers don't know, especially, I know I'm a YouTuber. I'm not saying don't watch my content, but still, if you want to know more about those things than YouTubers can get across, or you want things that are more in depth, go directly to the experts. Go to people who know what they're talking about. Go to, the Mises Institute. Go to Bob Murphy, has tons of books, Tom Woods, or read, people like Mises, Eugen von Bambauer, Karl Menger. You can read anybody from the Austrian School, of Murray Rothbard, of course, Hans Hermann Hoppe, all of these people you should read. And then that way you can truly understand, everything about anarcho-capitalism, everything about Austrian theory, everything about, ethics, all that stuff. So that's basically that.
YouTubers, they definitely have their value, but at the end of the day, it's always good to get it straight from the horse's mouth. So I definitely recommend reaching out to some of them. So, I guess basically, the message, if we were to break it down to the most basic, simple form, would be, don't hurt people and don't take their stuff, is something
right.
that I've often heard. Right. So with that said, I just want to wrap things up here and say, MRH Legacy, thank you very much for coming on. I think we've all gotten a lot of value out of this. Make sure to follow both MRH Legacy and myself on social media. Subscribe, comment, and above all, keep asking why. So everybody out there, have a good one. Bye-bye.